Hi everybody, welcome to our Governance Playbook series. Our webinar today is titled How to Develop Board Guiding Policies. Now, whilst this topic may sound rather dry and drab, our host Stephen Bowman has a few things to say about that, I'm sure, but more on that shortly. My name's Sean McDonald and I'll be your moderator for the next 40 odd minutes. And during our session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or just use the chat function if that's easier, and we'll be answering these at the end of each section, and we'll try and get through as many of these as we can. Finally, if you stay through till the end, and as usual for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey, you'll go in the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper from our friends at Taken Care Of, worth over $400. Now, for those who don't know BoardPro, we're a board software provider that serve over 15,000 users around the world, and we enable organizations to run their board meetings more effectively and efficiently with less time and deliver more impact and value for their organization. And as much as we're a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. So today, let me introduce our hosts and panelists. Our host, Stephen Bowman, is Managing Director of Conscious Governance, brings a great depth of experience from board reviews and strategic planning. Stephen has a wealth of executive and governance experience and has written over 14 books on governance and strategy. Good afternoon, Stephen.
Hi, everyone.
Graham Narkis co-founded Australia's first specialist governance consultancy. Since then, BoardWorks has worked with over 600 clients across all sectors. He keeps BoardWorks at the front of contemporary practice. Good afternoon, Graham.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be having a chance to talk about policy leadership again. Thank you.
You need to speak up a little bit, Graham. You're a little bit distant there. Brett Hurt is the co-founder and our CEO here at BoardPro. Brett is a serial entrepreneur, having built several high-growth businesses over the last 20 years. G'day, Brett.
Kia ora and hi to everyone.
Now, for the next 45 minutes, just relax, listen and add to the discussion by asking questions. The full recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck and white paper, will be sent out at the conclusion of this session. Now, our webinar series is centered around what we call the 3x5 governance playbook. Brett, as creator and author, would you like to explain why you created the playbook and what value it delivers?
Yeah, sure. So we set off with BoardPro to build a technology company along the way, and particularly technology for small, medium enterprise and not-for-profits. And along the way, we discovered we asked a lot of questions about how to do governance. And as we've understood more and more the needs of the core users of our product, we've realized, gosh, we need to step up and actually, help serve the wider governance needs, hence that broader purpose you heard before. So this is really the outworking of that, of us trying to codify, simplify, effectively minimum viable governance. So we're really at this series is well on the way through what we call the 3x5 governance playbook. We've essentially identified 5 primary processes. You can see them here, from developing strategic direction through to running the board meeting cycle, and really providing really practical guidance, templates, so stuff people can pick up and use in real life without having to pay an arm and a leg. So that's what it's about, and there's more material here on both the inputs and the outputs that serve those processes.
Thanks, Brett. Stephen, over to you about our dry and drab topic this afternoon.
We'll see if we can't change that a bit. Okay, let's go to that first slide that you got there of the triangle, because what I want to do is to get people to think about, why the heck are we talking about policies? Yes, we have to have them. Yes, we have to review them, and every board has them, and every board will review them, some better than others in terms of what they do. But why have we got them in the first place, apart from the fact we have to have them? So I thought we'd kick this one off just to refresh our role as a board. I mean, one of the things, you would have heard this on other webinars that we've run, my view on the role of the board is very simply that its job is to make the choices that create the future for the communities that we serve. And we've got certain tools that enable us to do that. And our most powerful tool, our most powerful strategic filter are our vision and then the values of how we choose to live them from day to day. So your vision or your mission statement is the big 30-year goal that you're after for. This is the difference that we want to make. And any policies and procedures should be aligned with this difference that we want to make. Then underneath that, you've got the Constitution, which is the formal document, and it's a constitution, articles of association. If you're a cooperative, then it's called rules. There's all sorts of different names for them. But this is the legal framework under which we agree to operate in our society. And so in terms of the Constitution, most directors have never read their Constitution. My view is every director should read it, but here's a couple of tips that you need to be aware of, some tricks and traps of it. First of all, always view your Constitution as a very funny, hilarious document. If you see your Constitution as funny, hilarious, then you look for the funny and hilarious bits in it. And I guarantee there'll be funny and hilarious bits in it. Any one director can call a meeting of the board. Really? You want that? Or any two members can call an annual general meeting. Oh, okay, I can have fun with that one. So, things in your Constitution, when you're reading it, you just say, okay, is this up to date with the current legislation? Is this what it says we should be doing? Are we doing it? It says we shouldn't be doing this. Are we not doing this? Does it make sense? And that's probably the best way to actually review your Constitution. So that's the legal side of things. Then you've got your strategic plan or your strategic priorities. Most organizations make this way too darn complex. So in essence, what we want to do in terms of strategy and strategic priorities, usually looking at the 2, 3, maybe 4 top things. What are these top things we've got to get right in the next 3 years that will enable us to actually deliver against our vision, that will enable us to create this difference? That's what our job as a board is. So we need to really understand these strategic priorities and at the same time recognize that they're out of date, the date they're written. We need to continually be reviewing, looking at what else is coming, what are some of these whispers of the future that are coming up. And then in terms of policies, are our policies fit for purpose to help us get there? Now, the point of today's webinar is to now look at policies. And one of the biggest things that we've found with many boards is that either they don't know what policies they do have, or they've got thousands of the darn things and they're not quite sure what to do with them. So what we want to do today is to give you a framework to look at policies in a way that actually makes sense. And Graham and I were talking just prior to this about, the role of any policy more than anything else is to articulate the mindset that we want to have and then provide the actions that support that mindset. The role of policy is not to be a piece of paper. The role of policy is to add value so the board can get on and do its job. Graham, that's a segue to you.
Yeah, look, I think a couple of things I'd comment on. Can you hear me okay? I was a comment about sound quality. Okay.
Good now.
Yeah, look, I think first thing I just reinforces the sense of hierarchy, that there's a descending or cascading approach, not just to the things that you've got on the diagram, Stephen, but also within the policy set. You start from very high, abstract, all-embracing policies to something that's more detailed according to need. The other thing to just reinforce is that the board's work is essentially intellectual. It's about thinking things through, and I think that reinforces the comments that you were making before. The board's job is not to have its sleeves rolled up, although in some organisational contexts that's necessary as well in terms of helping with the operations. But the board's most important job is to frame the work that's going to be done by the organisation and the purpose for which it is done.
And that means a lot of thinking needs to go into it about what is it that we actually want to have happen, whereas most boards will go into what is it that we need to do. And that's missing the point. Sean, if you can go back one.
Could you go back one, sure? Can I jump in, Stephen, and
ask
a question?
Of course.
So I think the way you're talking, Stephen, so in this diagram, there's that second to bottom layer that's got the word policy across each of the 4 segments.
Yeah.
I think you and Graham are saying actually this whole triangle, this whole pyramid is all policy. Have I got that right?
Well, it's a way of looking at the world to help us as a board make the difference that we know that we can make. And all of these things in that diagram are tools. Those tools are useless unless we get into the headspace where we need to be as a board, because these can be used for good or for bad, for the light side, for the dark side. But what we've got to understand as a board is we are here to create the future. So what do we need to put in place to actually start creating the future? And we need to have a 10-year, 20-year horizon for some of the things that we know might be possible. But now what do we do in the next 3 years? So that's your strat plan. Now, what are we going to do this year? That's your business plan. Now, what are we going to do at the next board meeting? Well, that's looking at all those things to make sure we don't miss anything. So if you look at the structure of a board meeting, it should always be, okay, so what are the big ticket items coming down that we haven't talked about before, the things that might have a 5-year implication to us, and there's ways that you can bring those to the board. That's probably the first discussion. The second discussion might be, okay, so how are the big strategic areas that we're working in? How are those projects going? Is there anything we need to know about that? What are the finances telling us for what might be not only now, but in a year or 2 years' time if these trends were to continue? And are we happy that the staff are doing everything possible because we've given them the guidance through policy? Knew I threw that word in somewhere. Now, the interesting thing, Brett, is that when you're starting to look at places like startups, for example, so if any of you are into small business enterprises or small, medium enterprises or startups, you're probably going to be more focused on the doing in the next 12 months and not have in place maybe some of the policies. But what we want to do today is to say to you that let's look at the policies that you should have in place because the law says you've got to have them. And that's one of the elements that we'll cover. Brett, did you want to talk about that yet or a bit later?
We'll do that later on, I think, Steve.
Sure.
Keep on your flow.
All right. So one of the things I think is to, and this is what we've found has helped many boards, is to understand there are 4 different types of policies, 4 different types that the board need to be aware of, but there's only 2 types that they need to actually take ownership of. So the 4 types of critical policies, the first one is legislative and compliance. So these are the policies where the law says you, the director, you, the board, are responsible. And there's not only in legislation, but there's common law examples of where directors and boards have been held to account for failing to have or not following the policies. The most obvious one is work health and safety, right? So it's very clear now through the last 2 decades that this is a board responsibility and the directors will be held accountable if the policies weren't in place or if they weren't appropriately monitored and followed and someone dies. So that's a sort of an extreme example, but it's every week something like that happens. And unless you've got a really good policy in place and people understand it, their mindset is about work health and safety and their actions are supported and that's codified through the policy, you're putting yourself as directors at risk. So there's things like bullying, harassment. We know there's all sorts of examples where boards and directors have been held liable because they knew that there were issues with the culture of the organisation and they did nothing about it. It was brought to their attention and they ignored. So then the organisation can get sued or the individuals can get sued. So, bullying and harassment is another one. Now, these are the ones that are legislated are in fact board oversight responsibilities. So it makes an awful lot of sense that we identify what those ones are and we elevate them to the board sign-off process. Many organisations will have these policies, but they'll be signed off at the staff level. No, they're board policies and they have to be signed off by the board, that we understand them, we're comfortable that these things are happening, we have exception reports in place, but more importantly, it's providing the mindset that we want this culture of this organisation to demonstrate. It's not a piece of paper. It's a mindset that is followed by actions, way of looking at the world. Graham?
Yeah, look, I'd just like to reinforce that, but it's also the examples you used are good examples of how the mandate is expanding all the time in terms of the legislation and its interpretation. The last 30 years has been a succession of new compliance obligations, to the point that compliance can really, the conformance bit can outweigh the performance side of the board's job. But in terms of expanding mandate, your example of health and safety is a good one, because it has now expanded into an area that, if I go back a bit to my chief executive days, we never thought of as a board responsibility at all, and that's organisational culture. And the things you were talking about, bullying, harassment, and all the rest of it, that's expanding the notion of what health and safety at work is about.
Yeah, and then you add on top of that one of my favourites, which is whistleblower. And again, if you look at it, it all comes back to the culture of the organisation to some extent. Whistleblower is you need to protect someone who is able to show that things are not where they should be. And there's examples of where whistleblowers have been hung out to dry, and the board has been held responsible for not actually putting in place the whistleblower protections that should have been in place. So all of these things, none of them are difficult, but what it does is it helps articulate the mindset that we want our board to have, because unless the board have it, how can you expect the staff to have it? So the mindset, and then what are the actions that we need to agree? Because otherwise, if an incident occurs, then you run around like, now this is a very Australian expression, you run around like a headless chook. You run around as if the sky's falling and saying, my goodness, what are we going to do? Whereas a policy supported by the procedures give you the evidence of what it is that needs to be done. So I'll come back to that in a second, but get in mind, the first type of policy that the board has to take ownership of are those that are the, can you go back one, Sean? Sorry, you've moved too fast. The policies that are around legislative and compliance. Now, we've provided you, everyone on this call, we've provided you with a list of all these policies. We'll do that at the very end. You'll get all that. I don't want to go through them all, but we've done the hard work for you. Now, you need to make it country specific. So, it might be called work health and safety in New Zealand, but it could be called something quite different in South Africa. So, but you'll get the gist behind it. Now, the second type of policies, having identified the ones that we are responsible for at law as directors, the next style that we have to take control over or take oversight of are those policies that help us do our work as a board. These are the board operations policies. These are the policies that enable us to do our job and the staff to do their job. Now, the most common examples of that are things like a financial policy, for example. Okay, here's an investment policy. Now, it's board operations, but it sets the guidance for what the staff can and can't do. Another example is delegations of authority policy. Here's what we can do, here's what staff can do, here's what our board committees can do. You can start to look at things, even, one of the things we're looking at now is risk management policy, for example, is a board operations policy. It's not legislated that the board must have one, but what it is under the various standards of each of the jurisdictions, is that it's part of the quality control framework, which is you must have a board approved board risk policy. And then underneath that, a risk appetite statement, which then, and again, the only purpose of these is to make sure our mindset is where it needs to be and that the actions follow that mindset. So if you can get that into our conversation about policy, it's not about compliance. It is about mindset, actions, and then we can monitor whether or not we're doing it, which is the compliance component. So board operations, yeah.
Can I leap in, Stephen? So I'll just add a bit of flavour to this. So I'm sitting here with my CEO hat on. I think what you're essentially saying is, if I don't have a policy, I've got to guess the mindset of all my board members coming into every topic, every decision I'm making on the operational floor of the business. always in the back of my mind, I've got to consider, would the board agree or disagree with this? So by having policy, it just frees me up to know their mind and be able to apply their mind.
I wished I'd said that. That was very good. That's exactly right. But what it does is that when you start looking at your board papers, for example, one of the biggest issues facing boards these days is the sheer size of the board pack, the sheer size of number of papers that they get. If you start to look at policy, and as part of the board pack, you relate a particular paper back to a board policy, that gives the framework for why this should be going to the board, so that you can actually tie it in with policy. Graham, you do a lot of work in this area.
Reinforce that point. I think it's really important for staff preparing papers for boards to always put a policy reference on it if they can, because that takes the board back to what it has already said is important.
Nice.
Yeah, exactly. So just to finish off, if you get in mind these 4 types of policies, there's those that are legislative compliance. There's usually about a dozen of them, 10, 12, something like that. Policies that are that help the board do its work, there's usually 8, 9 or 10 of those. The next stop, we now get into operational policies. The first 2 were governance policies. These next 2 are operational policies. So the next style of policy is those policies that affect directors, but directors aren't in charge of them. So the policies that affect directors might be reimbursement of expenses policy. Now, you've got to know about it as a director, but you don't have to sign off on it, nor do you need to monitor it. But it affects you in some way. Use of vehicles, social media policy, those sorts of things. They don't go to the board for approval, but they do affect directors. So you may as well help identify those policies that directors should be aware of, but you know that they're not going to the board for approval because they are operational policies, but they affect the directors. And then the second type of operational policies, the 4th type of policies, those policies that don't affect directors. Okay, so they're more of the operational policies, how within our departments we do things, how we deal with complaints, for example, might be one that is more of an operational policy. So you just need to identify in the policy suite that you've got, what are those that are compliance and legislative? What are those that help the board do its work? What are those that affect directors? And what are those that just don't affect directors? And then all of a sudden, you've got an understanding of these 15 to 20 policies fit within the first 2 categories. They're the ones that the board must monitor, must review, and must formally sign off. I mean, a really good example of this is I know I talked to a number of insurance companies over the years, and what they've said to me is, look, if something goes wrong, the first thing we do as an insurance company is ask to see the policy. The second thing we do is ask to see where the board signed off on it, if it was a governance-related policy. If it's signed off by the staff, that raises real questions about whether or not that insurance will kick in. So, I mean, there's a bit of enlightened self-interest in this as well, too.
There's a good question, Stephen, there that fits into this section, which is, would a COVID management policy, for example, be something a board should sign off rather than the exec team?
I would say that is a policy that is going to assist the board, and it will have an effect on the board. I would make an argument that it's probably at high level, it's going to be a board sign-off at the highest level. And then the procedures underneath that will be what the staff put into place. But the policy, I mean, it's got far-reaching effects because it'll have an effect on staff, it'll have an effect on the livelihood. So it's a bit like an extension of work health and safety to some extent. Graham?
I think that again,
can you move closer to the microphone, Graham?
If we look at some of those examples that have been used, is that better? Does that sound nice?
Yeah, unjust, yeah.
Yeah, then you can see this hierarchy cutting in again, because your social media one that you were referring to before, for example, the board needs to voice its expectations around something that would then provide a hook to a specific social media policy at an operational level, because it's around individual director behaviour, for example. So, you'd want something at a high level at the board level in terms of those board operational policies that says that no director should bring the organisation into disrepute.
Yes. Yep, exactly. So the purpose of today is to really give you a mindset of how to look at policy. And the first thing to do, my suggestion would be to start to look at what policies you have in place. So if we move on, Sean, if you move on with the slides to the one that says reviewing policy, keep going. We've covered all that. Yep. Okay, so reviewing policy, a couple of points there. Policy is always an evolving document. It's always something that we should be looking at. And reviewing a policy is not just about saying whether or not it's plain English. There's a number of key elements in there. And what we find most boards find very useful is that they will either through a subcommittee, usually the governance committee, sometimes the finance and audit and risk committee. Sometimes they split them between the various committees, but on a regular basis, on a regular schedule, review the policies. So here's some tips on how to review a policy, because you won't find this written in the more traditional policy books. First of all, ascertain whether or not it's reflecting the latest legislation. Guess what? Things change. So I know in New Zealand, for example, there's a fantastic service in New Zealand that provides you with updates of any changes in legislation that affect a company. I can't think of the name at the moment, but there's in every country there'll be some sort of service where it gives you an update on what the latest changes in policy or legislation might be. Your peak body for the sector that you represent, your peak body will have it. So it could be either the small business peak body, or it could be the health peak body, whatever it is. But always keep up to date with what the latest relevant legislation is and see whether or not our policy actually reviews and reflects that. The second element there is to make sure it's in plain English or plain South Afrikaans or in plain whatever the language is, that you can actually make sense of it. Because if it's in legalese, you need to understand what it actually means. So make sure that when you're reviewing it, you don't just get lawyers to review it. That's probably not in your best interest. What you do want to do is to get someone to look at it and say, does this make sense? Why is this here? If I was to look at this, can I actually see what that they're trying to get at? Now, number 3 and number 4 to me are the most important. If you're reviewing a policy, whatever it might be, ask what are the past incidents and that this policy reflects, and whether or not this policy was actually relevant in dealing with that incident. So many examples I see where some boards are actually reporting breaches of policy and what it is that the policy was unclear about that caused the breach, or where it was clear and someone just breached it. So always look at past incidents. And I'll tell you a story in a second that brings all of this into highlight, a real life story from about 6 months ago. Then review what has been learned from that near miss, from that incident. What did we learn from it that would make this policy more useful? So these are really good examples. So let me give you an example, and then we'll pull over to questions. So there was this organisation up in Queensland, which is north of Australia, and they, as part of the services they had a boarding school where young men and women would come and stay there for 6 to 8 months at a time, and they had a range of different people who came to this boarding facility. It was near a river, and on one Sunday, one of the staff members happened to notice a young man walking down to the river with a rope in his hand. So they followed him down to the river, and they sat on the banks of the river, and they had a great chat for about an hour and a half about how was the family and how are things here, and what's happening with your friends and what's happening in the employment space that you're looking at the moment. So they had a really good chat for about an hour and a half, and then they walked back up to the facility. The staff member lodged it as a near miss under work health and safety. And I was very fortunate to have been at the board meeting, because at the board meeting, as part of their work health and safety report, they literally lodged this as a near miss. And two of the best questions I've ever heard were asked at that board meeting. The first question that was asked by one of the directors was, did any of our policies help this staff member deal with the situation, our work health and safety? How did that staff member know what to do? And the CEO said, that was exactly the question I asked a staff member. She said, I asked her, how did you know that this person was likely to do some self-harm? And she said, well, I didn't know, but because I'm always looking out for the welfare of our people and I'm always attuned to where they are at the moment, it was just the right thing to do to follow him down to the riverbank. And then I didn't know what I was going to talk to him about, so I just talked. Did I think it was work health and safety? No, it was what I knew had to occur. Did the policy help you? The staff member said, well, I went back to make sure that I sort of covered off on the things, and even though it wasn't front of mind, back of mind, everything. I actually saw the sequence behind it. So that was the first question. The second question another director asked then was, well, what did we learn from this? What a great question. What did we learn from this that would make our work health and safety policy even more useful, even more effective? And the thing that came from that was a conversation about policy saves lives. Policies save lives, not just, potential self-harm, but they actually have a huge impact on the whole culture. And so they had a conversation then about the power of policy to create mindset. So there's an example of a policy that saved a young fella's life. That's all. That's probably one of the most stark examples, but that could happen in any incident, not just about saving someone's life. It could save reputation. It could save future. It could do a whole range of different things. Graham, did you want to add anything to that?
Look, I think the only thing I'd add is that the board needs to develop an understanding of when it has said enough about a particular policy. And it's very hard to codify where that point is. But for me, it's intuitive. It says, I say to myself, if this is the policy that we're going to go forward with, can we be confident that people who are delegating the decisions under this policy, can we be confident that they will make the right calls? And if we can't say that, then we've got more work to do at the board level to refine or better articulate what the policy objective is.
Thanks.
Let's rattle through. Were you going to take us through a few of the questions, Sean?
Yeah, I was. So the first one from Cecilia is, when you're saying sign off, how do you consider it's been signed off? Would a board minute be sufficient? A screenshot of voting results, perhaps, through a voting app?
Keep it simple. It's just a board notification in the minutes that the board have signed off on this policy on such and such a date.
Right. This question from Phil.
Oh, sorry. And then at the bottom of the policy, last reviewed, signed off at such and such board meeting.
Right.
So you should always be able to, if I was to do an internal audit, if it said in that policy that it was signed off in the December 21 board meeting, I'd want to be able to go back to the minutes of December 21 board meeting and say, yes, the board formally signed off on this policy.
Right.
I'd like to add to that, because I think it's really important that decision doesn't stay in the minutes, but the new policy is added to some sort of compilation where everyone can access it who needs to understand the policy.
Yeah.
I'm going to do a quick shameless plug here for BoardPro. So in BoardPro, you could actually use our decision feature when you're doing the minutes, which would log, then you'd have a list of all decisions relating to adopting policies or reviewing them. And we've also got a governance registry document repository, where you could load those. So, that would allow you to do execute on what Graham is suggesting.
Yeah, can I just add to that? One of the great gifts of board portals, in particular BoardPro, because it makes it really simple, is that it automates this stuff, but it's not just for the fact of automating, but it makes it accessible and easy for everyone to access. And it enables you to cross-link things, which as a direct result, the size of your board packs should, if not must, reduce, so that we start to focus on the important stuff, not just on, if I give them more information, that's what they're after. sort of mentality.
Stephen, I'm just looking at time here. We're at 1:30. What is the time? 1:35. So we've got a few more questions here, which I think we should get through.
Go for it.
One from Colin. Where do the environment impacts fit into policies?
Okay, so there are two types of policies that are becoming much more popular, and I would put them in the second type of policy, which is those policies that allow the board to do its work. But I guarantee some of these will become legislative compliance in probably 10 years' time. And those two types of policies now are the ESG policy, environmental, societal, and governance. And many boards are starting to actually take them on as policies, not because it's nice, but it forces strategic conversation at the board level about what do we mean.
I'm going to insert myself in here, Sean, and say we will run a separate session on this where we'll do a deeper dive and do lots of Q&A. We're looking in the future to do more where we get a lot of interest. So let's stick it to the schedule, because I know there'll be a lot that want to see us get through the rest of the schedule here, because you've got more slides, I believe, Stephen, to work through, and we've only got less than 10
Mind
minutes.
you, I have talked about most of them already without needing to look at them. So skip on that one. The other one, just to finish that off, the other one that we're seeing more and more boards use is a DEI. Don't we love acronyms? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not because it's a nice thing to have. It forces the board to think about diversity, equity, inclusion, not just from a social perspective, but from a strategic understanding of potential future implications perspective. Very, very powerful. Okay, other questions?
We'll move on, I think, Stephen.
Okay, move on. All right. Now, in the notes, you'll see this workflow process. I think we can move on from that. We've covered all of that anyway. And one of the things that was mentioned before is the idea of a register. Now, BoardPro have already a policy register. But one of the things we see that many boards don't have is that they have all these policies everywhere, but no one knows where all of them are. And they're usually not in one place. You've got to go looking under the staffing area to find a staffing policy. So at the very least, set up a spreadsheet that actually says, here's our register of key documents. Here's where it's located. Here's when it was last reviewed, when it's due to be reviewed, who owns it or who signs off on it, who's the authorizing person, whatever you want to put in there, just make it really simple. Now, the thing with BoardPro is that is all automated for you. So I don't have to sit down with a spreadsheet. But if you're not using any board portal, for heaven's sake, just develop up a simple spreadsheet. When we do governance reviews or board reviews, one of the first things I ask for is, can I see your register of key documents? Oh, we don't have one. Well, where are your key contracts? Well, there's some over here and there's some over there. Yeah, where's your policies? Well, it depends which one. They're in different places. Okay, let's make it easy for our board to focus. Let's actually consolidate. Okay, so one of the things, we're not going to go through these, but as part of what you've got, and this is probably worth just coming to this seminar just for these this list here. Here's a listing of all of the different types of policies. The first one is the enhancing, go back one, Sean, is the enhancing of governance systems. Then you've got director induction, board charter. And then the next page, you've got the 4 different types of policies, which are, moving on to the next page, the governance policies, legislative and compliance, then the board operations, those policies that the board need to be aware of. So so it's very, very clearly laid out in terms of what those policies are. Now, Graham, did you want to kick in here?
Jump in?
Yeah, correct.
Could I jump in there? Sorry, apologies, Graham. We've got a ton of questions coming through from what would be a lot of, very typical of our, BoardPro customer base. I'm a new director. I've only been given a few policies. Where do I start? Are you going to recommend, writers for these policies? So we've opened Pandora's box here, and we did talk before about giving some guidance for those that, and I've seen many of these organizations that'll barely have 1 or 2 of these. Where would we start, Stephen and Graham? What would you recommend?
Good question.
Yeah. Graham, do you want to kick off?
Look, I think all you've got to do is go online and do a Google, and you'll find that a lot of organizations have put their policies up on their websites in their governance documents. It's particularly true of listed companies, for example, but also a lot of the larger, better resourced not-for-profits have done the same thing, so that their policies are transparent, and so you can borrow them, you can adapt them. And the work that we've done for clients is to develop things like policy templates that they make available publicly. Sport in New Zealand, for example, has got a policy template that you can borrow from. So there's heaps of stuff around.
Stephen, you also have a
wheel.
Yeah.
Stephen, you also have a library of templates, I believe.
Well, we do. We have some templates that we make available, but do you know what happens? Every single one of you can do this yourself. However, many say, we can't be bothered. Can you do it for us? So my first reaction is, if you have very few policies, then pick out those key ones under each of those headings. So yeah, for me, if I was to pick out a key one, can you go back up one slide, Sean? If I was to pick out the key ones that I would want to have, no matter what size my board is, these are the ones that are going to protect me. Okay, go down one. We're missing some, sorry. Yeah, missing a whole stack. So there we go. Look at number 7. So the things that I'd want to do, if you have no staff, you probably don't need EEO yet. If you have no staff, then you probably don't need whistleblower policy. But every organisation should have a grievance procedures. Every organisation has to have a privacy policy. So these are the simple ones. If you've got staff, then you start to need to look at things like equal employment opportunity. But if you're not employing, it's not as relevant. If you have volunteers, you'll need a workplace health and safety policy. So pick and choose those ones. If you're dealing with children, you of course have got to have child safety and safeguarding policy, whatever the equivalent is. So there'll be 3 or 4 in the legislative and compliance ones that you've just got to have. And then you look at the ones that help us do our job as a board. Well, there's some ones in there, sponsorships policy, for example. Under what circumstances should we be accepting sponsorships, if that's the area that you're in? Very, very simple. My idea. The best way of describing this is, you've heard the phrase, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do you get your policy suite together? One policy at a time. Just start. And then you can use the list that we gave you courtesy of BoardPro to help go through the ones that you know here are the ones that you got to have. Brett?
Look, all I would say here, as I've been monitoring the questions which are flooding in, we'll definitely do an hour session where we'll have much more time to be more interactive and handle questions, because there's many more today than we could handle. So I think you've done a great job, Stephen, with Graham's able support to open the topic for people, and there's a lot of interest there. And I would just give a shameless plug as well to Graham and Stephen. If you need help and support, those guys are experts. If you've got budget, you can engage them. Otherwise, Google's your friend.
True story.
All right, so we're at the end of our webinar, everybody. I hope you found that enjoyable. Please feel free to connect with our host and our panelists today on LinkedIn. I'm sure they'll look forward to your connection. So again, Stephen's specialty area is independent board governance reviews, strategic planning, and indeed the topic of today's webinar. Graham's primary interests are in exploring opportunities for boards to be more effective in giving direction to their organisations. And of course, Brett leads BoardPro and is always keen to explore ways in which BoardPro's board management software can assist the entire governance process for organisations. So just to finish off, this is an example of the webinars we have coming up over the next month or so, specifically on March 24th, which you might find very interesting, is what to do with new board members, the first 100 days, what you need to focus on. So you'll receive an email from us very shortly, and this will include a video of today's webinar, the presentation slides, and our topic white paper. And we'll also post this collateral to our webinar page, which is boardprohub.com/webinars, and that'll be done over the next 24 hours. So as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute quick survey. Go into the draw for our hamper, which is worth over $400 from our friends at Taken Care Of, and we'll announce the winner shortly after the webinar. Thanks everybody. Thanks Stephen, Graham, Brett for your input today. It was fantastic. We hope to see you back for other live webinars over the next few weeks. Thanks everybody.